I feel like it's...
Yep. Okay, well, I believe that we are now live. So welcome everyone to our conversation around how non-traditional education is influencing the future of manufacturing. Very excited for our panel to be here. We appreciate everyone in the audience attending. It's been a really engaging summit thus far, in my opinion. As a quick introduction, I'm Taylor McLemore. I'm the Managing Director of the Techstars Workforce Development Accelerator. And we actually have invested in some companies from the workforce perspective in the manufacturing space, and very excited about both the demand and needs and also the opportunities for workers in this space. So it's something near and dear to the thesis I invest against. But my goal today is mostly to be moderator. So I'm going to be just trying to engage the conversation for Anna and Joanne. And I would love for both of you to kick us off with some introductions on who you are and what you focus on. So Anna, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Hello, my name is Anna Thornton. So I'm a professor of the practice at Boston University. So I started life as an academic at MIT. Then I went into industry for about 17 years in both large companies, and then worked with Dragon Innovations, helping them bring products from prototype into production for a large number of startups. And then I joined BU about 4 years ago. So here at BU, I focus on our education around product design and manufacturing. But education's been a big part of my life throughout, whether it's, training, working with operators on the floor, trying to get them to have a more quality focused, executives on what's actually happening on the factory floor. And now I'm back in the classroom, and I teach a number of courses, including our additive manufacturing, my undergraduate manufacturing process class, so I get to train them the way I want to train them. And then I teach a course on product realization, which is about how you bring products from prototype into full production. So all of those steps around piloting, product launch, et cetera.
Thank you so much. Joanne, how about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Chen. I'm Director of Employment Technology Fund at Jobs for the Future, which is a workforce development nonprofit. So ETF, the fund, we are early stage investors focused on technology solutions for underserved workers. So you can think of there are VCs out there that are focused on a sector or an industry. We are a venture fund focused on a population, which is workers who are in roles that would be considered low wage or low to middle skilled. And we are increasingly interested in and focused on manufacturing jobs, including a recent investment in a company called FactoryFix that tries to connect manufacturing tradespeople with employers seeking to hire them. And so we're part of Jobs for the Future, which has been around for almost 40 years, a nonprofit that's got its fingers in everything from education to workforce development and all of the pathways in between. And we look a lot at non-traditional education pathways, different ways to finance those pathways. And so really excited to talk about how that intersects with manufacturing here.
Wonderful. Well, let's kick off by just defining some terms, right? Because we're talking about large swaths of manufacturing and education, and I think some specificity would be meaningful. So, whoever would like to go first, when you think about non-traditional education in the manufacturing space, like, where does your mind go? How do you define that?
My first thought is just not a 4-year degree, and I also think of who's paying for it. And for us, we think a lot about that. There are many people who benefit from workers, particularly in manufacturing, becoming more skilled and advancing economically. And so that means there are a lot of people out there who should be supporting those educational pathways. So that's how we think about it.
Yeah. So I sort of think about, again, I'm coming at it from a very sort of academic point of view, but we can no longer just train our engineers and assume that they're going to get all the knowledge that they need to be an engineer going forward. Yes, do I go back and refer to my fluids textbook periodically? Yes, but most of the knowledge and most of the learnings that I've built over my career have occurred during my career as opposed to during that 4-year education. So I think we really need to think about how do we teach our students from a manufacturing point of view and also all points of view to become these lifelong learners. And one of the things we always say to our students is that the job descriptions that you're looking at LinkedIn in 20 years are going to be completely different. There's job titles that are on LinkedIn that I had no idea about them. And I think it's this idea that we need to we have to create students who are coming out of the university who understand that. But then I think we also need to give opportunities for people who don't go through that traditional educational process to get access to some of that education. And I think one of the things that COVID has really taught us is that this idea that we all have to be in a single room with a single faculty member in front of a whiteboard. I do miss my whiteboard, but that format, while really great for a group of 20 students to get that education across, we may be able to be much more efficient about how we educate a larger group of people using some of these tools. And I think all of us in academia, our heads are a little bit spinny from the last year, but I think it's moved us forward in a way that would not have happened without COVID. So there's a small silver lining. I'd prefer it not to have happened. But I think that's actually moved us forward in that way to really look at education very differently.
And a little bit of a meta question for you, but as an educator that's more within the traditional system, right? And maybe this is a similar space for many of the people in our audience that are leaders at manufacturing companies, probably higher potential or higher probability that they came through traditional pathways. Yet we want to enable the people in our factories to be successful. And to Joanne's point, in terms of population and employee population, a lot of those people come through non-traditional, or at least not the 4-year university path. How do you teach someone going through the traditional education system to think about building solution for those people that don't share that common pathway?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it's just walking a mile in their shoes. Honestly, I think I learned the most about how to teach people on the floor when I spent time on the floor. And I shared the story with Joanne and Taylor when we met about a week ago. But I had this great experience where I got to work with the railroads, and they brought me in to help make them more efficient. So you can imagine me, the fast-talking Yankee chick, going to the deep south of Alabama to help a crew of 60 guys who've been building railroads for 30 years each to help them be more efficient. But by the end, a lot of it was just spending a lot of time with them, understanding. And I was so proud of myself. One day I came to the forum of created this preventative maintenance sheet. We identified that preventative maintenance was a real key driver, and we'd engaged the whole team in brainstorming a whole bunch of stuff that needed to be had preventive maintenance. I built this beautiful checklist, and I brought it to him, and he said, it's not going to work. But it's called, and I was so engaged in my solution from my point of view. And he said, well, half the guys on the track can't read. They're illiterate. And it was one of those moments where it really knocked, and I felt terrible about it, but it was only by going and experiencing that. And then we changed it around. It was very easy. I didn't need words. I had pictures. But it's this idea that we come at it from a very different perspective, and from a very, a somewhat elite perspective of how information is communicated. And I think we really have to go onto the floor and understand where they're coming from to design materials that reach them in a way that matches what they need, how they learn, how their schedule is, and everything else. So I think we have to create empathy, which seems like lately it's been a little bit in short supply.
I'd 100% agree with that, and add that it's not just about the folks who have positions of power and are leading traditional educational systems right now, understanding the needs and voice of workers, but also giving workers the ability, the power, the voice, the opportunity to create solutions like that. One of our focuses as a fund is investing in entrepreneurs who have lived experience in the work that they're doing. I'm not super interested in investing in a company or an entrepreneur that's focused on manufacturing workers who doesn't know anything about manufacturing, who hasn't lived that experience. And so I would say that's another part. It's sort of the simultaneous lifting these voices and educating others.
I love that. Oh, sorry. I
was just gonna kind of add on to that. And one of the modes also is creating train the trainer. That the only way, if I come in and train something, okay, yeah, I come in and train it. But if a peer trains them, all of a sudden it becomes a conversation as opposed to a training. And so one of the things that I used to do when I was doing a lot of consulting was to create these train the trainers and give them the flexibility of, okay, here are the concepts we need to do. Here's the content these are the outcomes. Here's some suggestions about how to get from A to B based on my experience. But let's figure out what is that spec document as to what we need to have them understand, and then let them kind of design the path, because they come at it from a place of understanding and common experience. And I think that's another way to engage populations and I find that with teaching also. I mean, I always encourage my students to tutor each other, because if they can explain it, then they can do it.
A great point. Just connecting empathy to how you actually execute on building empathy around that train the trainer point. I also love the story from the train building tracks days, because I think sometimes in this world of digital innovation and AI and throughout all the acronyms, what you just described is how we make user interfaces better. And you were talking about on good old paper, right? It's just how do we go from complexity to simplicity and what can be understood. Joanne, I would love if you don't mind going a little bit deeper on your point about lived experience, and especially from an investor that's looking at a bunch of deals and you get to say, oh, well, this company's exciting, and you start to go deeper. What's your mental model, and how do you apply sort of framework thinking to seeing if it fits for a solution, depth of understanding of manufacturing? Would love to hear some of that story around that portfolio company.
Yeah, sure. So what I would say is, I guess the starting point for us is that the entrepreneur, the founding team, is going to know more about the business than we ever will. And so in some ways, we're trying to catch up. And in the diligence process, we're trying to understand how well they know a business that we don't know, And so, a good example is our investment in FactoryFix. The founder, Patrick, he previously founded a company in advanced manufacturing. And it was through that process he saw just how difficult it is to hire manufacturing tradespeople. There's a massive skills gap, massive labor shortage in this space. And so that's how he developed the concept for and launched FactoryFix. And it's really just, the company's taken off because he knew what the problem was in advance. He really understood the market and could design the product to fit that market. And so that's what we look for. And some of that is, we also look for in other cases, there's another company in our portfolio that's similar in some ways. It's not in manufacturing, but it's also a hiring platform, but it's for nursing professionals. And the founder is herself a nurse, has been in the space for a long time. It should also be noted she's a Black woman who the majority of certified nursing assistants, that reflects. And so I think that's how we think about it.
And I know from our previous conversation preparing for today, you also talked about how you really like to apply framework-based thinking to thinking about the manufacturing space. So would love to hear a little bit about how you've evolved into that across your career.
So was that for Joanne or for me?
For Anna, yep.
Okay. So how's that evolved? Through walking through a lot of factories. I think is the way to do it. And so, I grew up in a space of what I would sort of call the NASA engineering model, where you drew a box around something. You were given the gazintas and the gazatas of that box, and you analyzed the bejeebers out of it, and then you handed off that analysis to somebody else who connected all the gazintas and the gazatas, and the whole thing got tested to death and then was built once and gone on. And I think that there's been such a big change from that mindset, which is, where most of the current educators come from. That's the training. We're all sort of that era. But I think by shifting it to thinking, or trying to get people to think about the fact that they're not going to know everything. We have to build and test. We have to teach people to be learners in the process, because we don't have enough knowledge to be able to draw that box around and, okay, I'm going to understand this one little part, and that's going to be that's the part that I own. But rather to say, okay, there are things that I'm really good at, but what I'm really need to be good at is looking outside and saying, who do I need to be talking with? Whose needs do I need to be accounting for? What knowledge do I need to get? And then how do I go out and find those resources? So almost teaching hunters and gatherers in the engineering community.
I love that, in part because I feel like it's so mirrored to education and how the changes we've thought about in education as well, not just manufacturing of like you build it once and then you're supposed to be good to go. Whereas now it's much more about, as you said, lifelong learning, needing to constantly go back. And I think one of the interesting things that really just occurred to me as we were talking is we talk about non-traditional education, but the funny thing is that like we hold up the 4-year degree path as the traditional path, even though only a third of US workers have a college degree. And so I think some of what we hope to do with our fund, and I think what we think is valuable to the field more broadly, is to take that 4-year degree off its pedestal a bit, and say that that going through a high impact training that actually gets you a big bump in pay and gives you a career path, why is that worse than a 4-year degree? Why is that less respected than a 4-year degree? It shouldn't be.
Yeah, and I'm sure my university seniors who get paid to think about this much more than I do would hate me to say this, but that's very true. I mean, I think we as academics need to do a lot of soul searching about what is that value. There's a really great book called The End of College, which I read before I started teaching here, and it was really interesting. It basically said that for most people, if you're getting into a university and you have a 4-year degree, really what that signals is you got into that degree program at the age of 18. Mm-hmm. And there's certain programs that are, like our engineering program is incredibly rigorous and hard, and to survive it, you have to have a certain number of skills. But to a certain extent, it doesn't really, that degree and that signal of that degree may not necessarily be in line with the skill sets of the people that have it. When I look at folks, I'm looking at, can they think independently? Can they go out and be lifelong learners? Can they work with teams? Can they think outside the box? Can they go out and really think of things in terms of systems, as opposed to, I got an A in calculus? I mean, the fact they got an A in calculus doesn't tell me very much about whether or not they're going to be somebody I want to hire in a manufacturing job. Mm-hmm. And that signal is off.
Yeah, some of those skills you named too are such a good point, that when we talk about sort of non-traditional education, a lot of it is around soft skills too. Like obviously hard skills are critical, particularly on a manufacturing floor, but like the soft skills are really what will differentiate individuals over time and what grows their careers, in my opinion.
So to just kind of pick on this theme that I think it's so exciting to hear you both talking about as the future is, education is both expanding to becoming a lifelong journey versus more sort of a point in time at the start of a career. But also then the delivery of education is getting smaller, right? And more iterative and more focused chunks. So how, both in Joanne with the entrepreneurs that you've been working with and in the students that you're working with in your consulting, how have you seen the application of educational chunks getting smaller and potentially more skills focused? I'm interested if you have any stories to share.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll point to FactoryFix again, so a big reason that we invested is because FactoryFix is seen, they connect workers with manufacturing roles, right? And they have seen that employers are demanding a few very core basic trainings, how to read a particular blueprint or something along those lines. I'm not a manufacturing person, so I'm probably using the wrong words. Apologies, everybody.
You got it. Okay.
And so these are like very bite-sized trainings, and it's almost like it's like the last mile. It's just carrying folks from, what they have learned previously to like just that little bridge to applying it in this particular use case. And so that's why we invested in FactoryFix, was to help them think through the strategy of that and help them find partnerships to launch those skill building opportunities. So that's one way that we've seen. And another I would say is you do see more and more of these like intensive training programs, almost like boot camps, but not related to tech. It's more related to, it can be for anything. We've seen a company focused on construction skills. We've seen folks in pretty much any industry trying to do these intensive short programs that meaningfully increase skills and thus meaningfully increase income potential.
Exciting new world, right? Instead of just, hey, you can't have this job, it's you have this gap. If you fill that gap, you can have this job, right? Like it's such an exciting way to think about the labor market evolving that does two things. One, I think it's much more human, right? And the second is that it gives agency to the individual. It allows them to say, oh, for me to get from point A to point C, you told me what B was. That's so meaningful. Anna, what about for you? What have you seen in this transition towards shorter chunks and more skill-driven education?
Well, I'm seeing a change in some of the programs, and I think COVID's going to be really interesting in that. I think now that we've all sort of thought about, okay, we have a videoed lecture and a set of assessments, because we've really had to change our mindset in academia to that, because honestly, after 15 minutes, the students all turn their videos off and fall asleep. So we really have to get those in those chunks that are much smaller in order to keep the students engaged. And I don't think that has to do with millennials. I just think that has to do with human brains. I mean, I do the same thing. I fell asleep in class, I'm sure, when I was an undergrad. But I think we're becoming much more aware of that because it's a day-to-day issue. The other thing that I'm finding is that a lot of universities and other programs industry wants to come in and say, I want this part of the course. I'm really interested in this part. I don't want to spend 8 weeks. I need 1 week, and this is what I need, and this is an identified gap based off of my strategy, what problems I'm seeing, et cetera. And that can be both at the worker level, but it can also be at the executive level, where there's been a failure in a product design, and they look at it and say, okay, we are really bad at setting specs. Okay, so we're going to go through across the whole company, and we're going to really we've sort of honed that down as a root cause. And what we don't do a really good job is linking our spec document to our quality test plan in the factory. And we've got to get the factory people and the quality spec people to actually have a conversation. And that's across those boundaries. And so what I'm seeing is that people are it's less of a training group that everybody has to go through course A, course B, course C. Rather, it's a much more strategic approach to saying, I have a need. I need to bring everybody up to the same pace. And let's go out and figure out a way to do that as efficiently as possible. And I see places like edX and other platforms starting to meet that need. I think also there's a much higher requirement for the production values required for teaching. I think we have to be paying attention to the production values of this material. I mean, God, our kids are all making TikToks in 15 seconds and explaining history. I think we as faculty members should be able to figure out how to do that in a much more efficient, a much cleaner way with, as I said, with those good production values.
No, I think that's very spot on with what I've seen as well. First, let me just say to anyone in the audience, if you have interest in asking any questions, I'll work to kind of curate and pull those up. On the right side of your screen, you should have a chat area, and there's a kind of slider arrow at the very top right near kind of your profile area in case you need to slide that out. And if you go to the stage area, it's one of the tabs at the top of the chat. You can put in any questions, and we can would love to incorporate those into this conversation. And there's a little bit of delay between sort of us speaking on our side versus Hopin pushing it out. So if you can just have a little patience, we'll work them in as soon as we can, but share them. While we're waiting for any questions that do come in, I want to go to the flip side of this. We're talking about Brave New World. This is amazing. Education is becoming more focused, directly connected to the jobs that need to be done. That's all good. What does this mean for us as humans, right? Like the 4-year education and core requirements, and you need to go do electives as well, is a story about well-rounded humans. It's a story about, citizens of a democracy, right? Talk to me about the other side of this. In this world that we're stepping into, how do we ensure, because there's always, there's always risks with any change, but we can build new innovative solutions. So how do we balance those?
100%. I love this question because I think there is a risk here. There's a risk that education and training and learning becomes short-term focused. It's what can we do for the next role, for the next job, for the next, few months. As opposed to some of those broader skills that you're talking about that a lot of liberal arts educations, similar to ones that we've had, I'm sure, promote. And so I do think I think there's risk there. And so I think the balance is that previously when we talked about traditional education, your goal was to get the 4-year degree. Your goal was to get good grades and get to a 4-year degree. And the goal was the degree. The goal wasn't necessarily learning. The goal was the degree, right? And so I think the more we can foster the culture and the motivation around I'm learning to learn, obviously there are equity concerns with that. There are some, there are folks who need to learn to earn, 100%. But I think there are ways that we can incorporate the love of learning, helping people find what they can not just earn a living wage in, but that they can love and excel at. I think the more we can do that, the better off we'll all be. I don't have a perfect solution for how to do that yet, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that this shift to shorter, more focused learning opportunities means that that's absolutely the case. In some ways, it can help you explore it because you don't have to go back for a 4-year degree to see if you like a particular field. You can take a smaller course and try to test it out, dip your toe in the water. And so I think there are opportunities like that.
Yeah, and I would just sort of add, I had a very traditional, I had an engineering degree, but I came from a very traditional liberal arts college. I was at Princeton. And my classes on opera and my classes on art history actually helped me be a better thinker because I think that there are many different modes for us to exercise our brain, to think about patterns, to think about things, and whether we apply that to engineering or if we apply that to art history. I think by giving people a range of experiences, so I do see the value of a liberal arts education as opposed to more of a strategic education as opposed to a tactical education. The problem that I see now is that that education is become only available to a very select elite people who can get in, who can afford it, and who have been trained to be able to succeed in that environment. And I think those 3 things are areas where we need to be looking back at our education system all the way back in so that we are creating a population of people and create the funding for a wider variety of people to be able to experience that, not just based on the fact that you're born with parents who already went to Princeton or already went to Harvard or whatever. That I think that we are sort of the people who have the luxury of that kind of education or the joy of that kind of education. I'd love to be able to see how do we bring that to a more diverse set of people. And I think that's one of the things I really struggle with as well, that it shouldn't be left just to the select elite few.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And it very much goes in the category of unanswered questions for me, but meaningful ones. And especially, I'll loop it back to I think a point that Joanne, you were making of how critical soft skills are to the success of our workforces. And, I loved having the opportunity to study art history at one point. I don't necessarily apply it. It taught me great analytical skills, but the real point is how do we distill these elements down of both if someone wants to learn art history, how's that available to them? But also if the point was sort of complex analysis to see patterns, there's multiple ways to deliver that, and also to do it within our workforce environments, and how to the employers start to say, how can I incorporate some of those pieces, and really think of upskilling and reskilling not just as the hard skills, but the soft skills along with it. So I think it's very exciting stuff. We got our first question in, so it's a great one. So I'm gonna read that and then open it up to both of you, whoever would like to respond first. But it's, as software tools around manufacturing get more complicated, what does the onboarding process or learning curve look like for individuals that do not have a technical degree or experience working with complex technical software tools? And that might be required for them to be efficient at their job. So the question is, do you think that there are opportunities to create lighter, more focused versions of the same software tools to address the problems?
Yeah, I would say real quick that it sort of points to Anna's earlier point, which is that if the product is supposed to be used by workers who don't know how to use it, then I'm not sure that design was a good design, that's good software for and I would question sort of the lived experience of the person who had designed that software. And so to me, I think there's a simultaneous process. I think it's a given now that people have to be increasingly digitally literate. And so that is education opportunity that needs to be made more accessible. But in addition to that, I think there needs to be, we need to give opportunity to people who know the needs and know the circumstances of the manufacturing floor to actually create solutions that meet those needs. And one good example, actually, Taylor, you'll know better than I do, but a good example is a company called Increment, and Increment is really designed to, they're essentially trying to create a feedback loop between training and performance and productivity, right? And so by really understanding what training an individual has gone through and what their productivity looks like, and understanding what the gaps in the training are that are impacting productivity, it can help create the financial incentive for the company to invest in a worker's education and training. I would love for there to be a broader discussion of shouldn't companies have a responsibility beyond their bottom line to support and support their workers more broadly. But that's a good example of, within our current system, how do you have those feedback loops to support training and make sure that whatever systems you're using are working for your workers.
Yeah, and I think there's, when you bring in a software package that nobody can use, and then all of a sudden you bring it up, I think there's been failures on multiple points. One, obviously somebody thinks the software is going to solve a problem and hasn't really thought through the implementation. I mean, we see that all the time. They're like, oh, the software system is going to solve all of our problems. Well, it's actually the people who solve problems. Software doesn't solve problems. Software enables people, but if people can't use it, it doesn't work. So I think that there is a failure, or sometimes people want to buy a solution, sort of like the diet fads. Like, we've all seen the diet fads go in. None of them are permanent solutions. The best way you do it, it's the hard work. You exercise and you diet. Like, we all know that. There is no pill that solves that problem. But I think people view software that way. So I think that's number one. Part of that is that companies need to take a much more strategic look at the long-term growth of their business. So if they know in 5 years, this is what the end is going to be, there's an on-ramp process that needs to happen. So they need to start thinking about, if they know they need to be fully IoT, digital, robotic, whatever that is, they need to start looking at that runway 3, 4, 5 years ahead of time and starting to train and build that infrastructure of that workforce, so workforce development. We spend a ton of time doing supplier development, making sure our suppliers have the right skill sets to support us. Why aren't we figuring out what our workers need to have to support us? That same level of attention needs to be done on workforce development. And then finally, yeah, the software people just need to have a lot more user-centric design. I mean, it's just, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're not looking at, it tends to be bells and whistles. We're all engineers, we love bells and whistles, but really getting to that core of what jobs are being done, what do we need to do that job, how is somebody doing that job, and then how do we support them in that best way, as opposed to creating these monolithic software systems that have so much flexibility nobody can figure out how they work, or only the writers can do it. And I see that actually in a lot of my entrepreneurs. Like I'm always trying, when I'm coaching them, like, okay, what's the use case? What's the story? What are you trying to get done? And let's get that really streamlined rather than trying to boil the ocean.
I would also just say that this is like not specific to manufacturing. I think everybody hates changing software, right? I remember I started my career as a management consultant, and I forget which version of Excel came out, and all of the junior folks loved it because there were so many new functions that like would really help us, but we couldn't use it because all the senior folks didn't want to learn the new system. And so I think again, this kind of goes to like the culture around learning and like the comfort with being uncomfortable and the interest in seeing the potential of something new versus just the cost of learning it, you know?
And I think a lot of this also comes back to creating literacy at a very young age. I mean, if you sort of think about an analogy of, I remember when word processors came out. I'm that old. And I remember when word processors came out, and at GE, my dad had to take a class on how to do word processing. Like nobody takes a class on how to do Google Docs anymore. It's kind of, God, my kids show me features that I forget. They're like, Mom, you should do it this way. And it's become so embedded in their language and the way they learn. You know, I sort of wonder, what are those skill sets that we need to be bringing into that educational side of things so that we are building those workers of the future? And it's not just robotic competitions. I think there's a certain amount of literacy and availability. And again, this also gets to the socioeconomic issues of, you know, they need to have computers, they need to have high bandwidth broadband. There are areas of the country which are traditionally very manufacturer, et cetera, that don't have the infrastructure to train the workers because we don't have broadband going into those communities. And I think we really need to if we are going to be building this infrastructure, if we are going to be looking at this, we need to look at not just how do we do a training to get somebody to learn word processing, but how do we build the infrastructure all the way back? And I think it comes to also infrastructure. My cousin lives in Arkansas, and she's in kind of the corner, and she still doesn't have broadband. I mean, I'm just always amazed, and I think that's something when we're on the East Coast and the West Coast that we forget to acknowledge, that there's broad swaths of the country where a lot of these traditional jobs have been that aren't supported by the tools that we need to have them for them to be successful next generation manufacturing facilities.
Yeah. I totally agree. There are systemic, like even talking about how we think about education, you know, as we have been in this conversation, you know, it starts way earlier than where we're talking about. It starts in K-12 and even earlier than that. And so there are systemic things, infrastructure, the educational system that impact all of this. And so some of it is we're sort of working with what we've got, you know, and need to kind of advocate within the system as well.
Yeah, to the degree that broadband speed continues to correlate to income level by zip code, this country is going to struggle to provide upward economic mobility for everyone. Completely agree. One thing I want to highlight that kind of touches on this point of if you don't build the solution for the end user with a deep understanding of the problem, a lot of what Joanne was talking about on just investing in founders with lived experience. And I want to highlight that you have a book coming out on product realization, and would love for you to, because we're excited for that and want to support that. So And if you want to
thank
share
you.
just a little bit, because I think it connects to this point, it's how do we make products, actually come alive through the entire life cycle?
Yeah, and so the book was basically because I was trying to teach this course on how to bring products from prototype into full production, and then I went to start teaching it, and it wasn't a textbook. So a bunch of folks encouraged me to write it. 3 years later, I've written it. But I think what's been really interesting about writing this book and getting it there is that I wrote it very much. You have to write a book in a very linear fashion. And the way that publishing happens, it's a book or it's a file. I really want this book. I really wish I could have this book be a software program with clicks and interactions and cross interactions. And I think this is one of the problems that we have with education right now is that our infrastructure is based on a textbook, standard format, series of lectures, set of problem sets kind of things. And it's tied in even just to the technology that we use to transfer information to students. And maybe in 5 years, I'll release the next version of this and it won't be, I still love my paper. I love flipping through books, but I also wish that it was more of an interactive resource where you could click on things and find glossaries and find terms. And we do have this technology to be able to do that, but we're not applying that in our educational structures. And as I said, I think COVID has really forced us to start thinking about how to do this. Right now, we're still scrambling with it. But I think that we could do a lot with applying this, all this great technology that goes into making video games. Like, why don't we take that and bring that into the classroom?
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to make a video game out of my book, they're welcome to.
That's wonderful. Actually, I know of a company out of Spain that's doing that. I'll have to connect you. They're trying to find that exact intersection. So we have one last question coming in, and then we're gonna work to end right on time. So I want to we'll do rapid fire response to this one, and then we'll transition to the next section of the summit. But it's is there any particular policy or practices to add or remove from the government side of things that can help towards this cause? And I think this cause was referencing our point about equity, accessibility of the education system to enable economic mobility. Everyone continues to be in agreement that the government is much slower than the commercial industry, but where do you think we can start? So any quick ideas to throw against such a great but broad question?
My first one is,
I would say,
align incentives. So make schools on the hook for their students, for their student success, and then you'll have much better educational outcomes. That's what
yeah, I think infrastructure. And I think that infrastructure includes broadband, access to content, getting the stranglehold of, and again, my editor's going to hate me for this, but getting the stranglehold of textbooks off of our educational process. I think it's giving teachers the resources that they need, paying teachers appropriately, and getting people to be engaged in teaching STEM, not just on the coasts.
Yep. Totally agree. The one thing I'll add on to just build on those points is I think that for a highly competitive economy, we need strong support of net neutrality because content ownership is concentrating. Both from it's clear on the entertainment side, but it's also true on the educational content side. And without net neutrality, we're going to see further and further restriction, even if the right infrastructure in place. How content and information gets delivered is at risk, in my opinion. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Joanne, Anna, thank you for your time, your insights. We really appreciate it. So thank you for joining us on this panel. For all of the audience, head over to the main stage. If the button isn't available for you now, it should be available in the next 30 to 45 seconds. And it's going to be very exciting. John Hill, the VP of Network at Techstars, is going to be leading a rapid fire session with lots of startups across the manufacturing space that'll be sharing how they're driving innovation, and it will hopefully spark some real ideas for you and potentially some opportunities for you to engage with those startups and see how they might connect with the problems you're trying to solve. So once again, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of the summit. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.